The heat in the cockpit was not the clean, dry heat of a forge. It was a suffocating, oily weight that pressed against the lungs, smelling of high octane and the sour reek of my own sweat soaking into the flight suit. I think it was July. Yes, July of 43. The dust on the airfield, somewhere near Belgrade, or maybe it was closer to Kharkov, the maps in my head have faded like old vellum, was a fine, choking powder that coated the back of the throat. It tasted of dry earth and burnt steel. I sat strapped into the belly of the beast, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. They called it the... To me, it was just metal. Metal that had been beaten, rolled, riveted, and forced into a shape that defied God's law of gravity. My hands, resting on the control stick, still felt like they belonged to a different life. They were wide, scarred hands, the knuckles swollen from years of swinging a 4-pound hammer against red-hot iron in my father's shop in Augsburg. I rubbed the pad of my thumb against the trigger mechanism. It felt cold, impersonal, not like the warm, living wood of a hammer handle. The Daimler-Benz 605A up front was idling, a low, guttural rumble that shook the fillings in my teeth. It was a sound I knew better than my mother's voice. 12 cylinders, inverted V, liquid-cooled, a masterpiece of engineering, they said. But to a blacksmith, everything is just stress and tension waiting to snap. And then I heard it. It was faint, so faint that if I hadn't spent 10 years listening to the song of cooling metal, I would have missed it. It wasn't the rhythmic clatter of the valves or the suck of the supercharger. It was irregular, a hesitation, like a piece of slag trapped in a weld. I leaned forward, pressing my ear against the thick glass of the canopy, straining against the roar. Was it real? Now sitting in this armchair with my knees aching from the damp, I wonder. Maybe it was just the blood pounding in my ears. Maybe it was the fear, that cold little worm that lived in my gut, whispering that today was the day the fire would take me. But I remember looking at the tachometer. The needle was steady. The oil pressure was good. The temperature was climbing, but it was always climbing on the ground in that Russian summer. Schmidt, you clear, the voice in my headset was crackly, distorted by the static. It was Mueller, I think. Or maybe Weber. No, Weber died in May. It must have been Mueller. He sounded young. Too young. We were all too young. But I felt ancient. 25 going on 100. Checking, I grunted. I didn't look at the ground crew. I didn't want to see their faces. If I saw them, I'd remember them. And I didn't have room for any more ghosts. I closed my eyes for a second, tuning out the world, focusing only on the vibration traveling up through the seat, through my spine, into the base of my skull. The engine was a living thing. It inhaled air and fuel, compressed it, exploded it. Violent, chaotic, but it should have a rhythm, a heartbeat. There it was again. A tiny metallic distinctness. A valve spring. A loose connecting rod bolt. It sounded like a hammer striking an anvil that had a hairline fracture. A dull, dead note hidden inside the ring. I tapped the glass of the gauge cluster. The mechanic, a grease-stained boy who looked like he should still be in school, gave me a thumbs up from the wing root. He couldn't hear it. He didn't know iron like I did. He saw a machine. I saw a collection of failure points. Schmidt, the radio barked again. Schwarm is rolling. Wake up. I opened my eyes. The heat waves shimmering off the cowling distorted the horizon. We were escorting Stukas today. The Ju-87s. Ugly, bent-winged vultures that were too slow and too old for this war. We had to keep the Ivans off their backs while they dove into the meat grinder of the Kursk salient. The biggest tank battle in history, the officers said. A clash of titans. To me, it just sounded like a lot of good metal being twisted into scrap. I should have cut the engine. I should have signaled the ground crew, told them the beast was lame. But the order had been given. The propeller wash from the leader ahead of me was already kicking up a dust storm. If I stayed, I was a coward. If I flew, I was a fool. The blacksmith in me wanted to pull the piece from the fire and examine it, find the flaw, reshape it. The soldier in me knew there was no time for the Ford. There was only the strike. I advanced the throttle. The engine roared a deep, throaty bellow that drowned out my thoughts. The lurched forward, straining against the brakes. I released them, and the world began to blur. The tail lifted. The wheels hammered against the hardened earth of the runway. The sound sharpened for a split second, a distinct metal-on-metal kiss that sent a shiver of ice through my sweat-soaked flight suit. It was the sound of a hammer hitting cold iron. A warning, but we were already moving too fast. The ground fell away. The dusk cleared. The blue sky, indifferent and vast, opened up to swallow us. I retracted the landing gear, feeling the heavy thunk of the wheels locking into the wings. I was committed now. I was flying a lie, suspended 500 meters above the earth in a steel coffin that was whispering its own death sentence. The air at 4,000 meters was thin and biting, a shocking mercy after the furnace of the airfield. Frost began to creep along the corners of the canopy, forming delicate, fern-like patterns that obscured the violence below. I adjusted my oxygen mask, the rubber smelling of stale breath and fear. Below us, the world had been unmade. The Kursk salient was not land anymore. It was a scar. From this height, the vast green steppes were gashed with jagged black lines of trenches, miles of anti-tank ditches that looked like surgical incisions on a gangrenous limb. And the smoke, it didn't drift. It stood in pillars, hundreds of them, oily and black, marking where tanks were burning. It looked like the floor of a great, hellish smithy where the devil himself was working overtime. I kept my head on a swivel, scanning the vast, blinding dome of the sky. The sun was high, a glaring white eye that offered no cover. My neck ached from the constant twisting, check 6, check high, check low. But part of my mind, the part that wasn't a soldier but a craftsman, was entirely focused inside the cowling. The temperature gauge. It was the only thing I truly saw. The needle was hovering at 105 degrees Celsius. High, too high for cruise. The rhythm had changed. It was faster now, synced with the higher RPMs. It wasn't just a noise anymore. It was a physical sensation, a subtle dissonance in the vibration of the airframe. It felt like holding a piece of metal against a grinding wheel that was slightly off-center. It made my teeth ache. Kurfürst flight bandits, 2 o'clock low, closing on the Stukas. The voice in my ear was calm, almost bored. That was the way we did it. You didn't scream until you were dying. I looked down, against the mottled brown and green of the earth. They were hard to see, dark specks moving like flies around a carcass. Yaks, wooden fighters, canvas and plywood. To a man who worked with steel, they seemed fragile, almost toy-like. But they were fast and they had teeth. Tally-ho. I whispered, the words lost in the roar. We rolled over. The horizon tilted, then vanished as the nose of the drop toward the earth. The speed built instantly. The wind roar over the canopy deepened, screaming like a banshee. I watched the temperature needle twitch. 108 degrees. I prayed to the machine. I wasn't praying to God. God wasn't in Russia. I was praying to the rivets, to the pistons, to the tolerance of the alloy steel. The Stukas were below us, diving in their terrifying near-vertical stoops, their sirens wailing, though I couldn't hear them over my own engine. The Yaks were swarming them, trying to pick them off as they pulled out of their dives, slow and heavy. I picked a target, a Yak 9. He was fixated on a Stuka, lining up his shot. He didn't see the hammer falling from the sky. I adjusted the mixture. Prop pitch, throttled. My hands moved with the muscle memory of a lifetime, independent of my fear. It was like shaping a horseshoe. You didn't think about the hammer blow, you just felt where the metal needed to move. The Russian fighter filled my Rivi gun sight. A wooden cross in a circle of light. Distance, 300 meters. Too far, 200 meters. Closer, 150 meters. I squeezed the trigger. The shuddered as the nose-mounted cannon and the machine guns fired. The cockpit filled with the smell of cordite, sharp and bitter. I saw the tracers lash out, bright yellow lines connecting me to him. Strikes. I saw pieces of wood and fabric fly off his wing root. It wasn't like hitting metal. Metal sparked. This just disintegrated. He rolled violently to the left, trailing white smoke, glycol. A cooling lake. He was done. Got him, I muttered, but I had stayed on him too long. I had lost my energy. Brake right, Heinrich. Brake right, the warning screamed in my headset. I didn't think. I slammed the stick hard to the right and kicked the rudder. The plane snapped into a high G turn. The world turned gray. My vision narrowed to a tunnel. The blood drained from my head, pooling in my legs. The G-forces pressed me into the seat, an invisible giant crushing the breath out of my lungs. I felt my face sagging, the skin pulling away from the bone. And then the engine screamed. It wasn't the roar of power. It was the shriek of metal tearing itself apart. The vibration was catastrophic. It felt like someone had thrown a handful of bolts into a thresher. The stick whipped out of my hand, battering my knees. A violent shudder ran through the entire airframe, threatening to rip the wings off. Black oil splattered across the windscreen, instant night. Smoke thick and acrid pumped into the cockpit, blinding me, choking me. I grabbed the throttle and yanked it back to idle, but it made no difference. The damage was done. The flaw in the iron had finally given way. A connecting rod, a piston seizing. It didn't matter. The forge had failed. With a final sickening, the propeller stopped dead. One blade was sticking straight up, visible through the oil-smeared glass, mocking me. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The roar was gone. The gunfire was gone. There was only the terrifying, high-pitched whistle of the wind rushing over the wings. I was no longer a pilot. I was a passenger in 5 tons of dead metal. I wiped the oil from my goggles with a shaking hand and looked out the side panel. The altimeter was unwinding fast. 3,000 meters. 2,000 below me. The battle raged on, a cauldron of fire and death, and I was falling right into the center of it. A glider made of steel, heavy and clumsy, dropping like a stone dropped down a well. I tried the starter. Nothing, just the hollow click of a solenoid engaging a dead mass. My stomach turned to ice. This was it, the nightmare, not the bullet, not the explosion. This, the helplessness, trapped in a falling cage, unable to fight, unable to run, just waiting for the ground to rise up and smash me flat. I gripped the stick, though the controls felt mushy and unresponsive in the thinning airflow. I was falling, and I was burning. I could feel the heat radiating from the firewall, hotter than any forge I had ever tended. I was going down. Chapter 3. The anvil of Kursk, the earth, did not welcome me. It rejected me with a violence that rattled my teeth loose. The belly of the slammed into the steppe, skipping once like a flat stone over water before gouging into the dirt. The screech of duralumin tearing against the hard-packed Russian soil drowned out the artillery. I was thrown forward, the harness biting into my shoulders, snapping my head back as the world dissolved into a brown, violent blur. Then stillness. Steam hissed aggressively from the shattered nose. The smell of hot metal, pine, and raw fuel flooded the cockpit. I kicked the canopy release, jammed. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I slammed my shoulder against the frame once, twice, screaming a curse that was half prayer. It popped loose, sliding back with a grind of distorted rails. I scrambled out onto the wing, slipping on the oil that coated the fuselage like blood. The heat was oppressive, a physical weight pressing down from the July sun, compounded by the radiating fever of the dying engine. I hit the dirt and rolled, coming up in a crouch, Luger drawn. No soldiers yet, but the landscape was alive. To my left, a T-34 burned, its ammunition cooking off in irregular rhythms. The air tasted of cordite and charred meat. I looked back at my bird. She was crippled, sitting slightly askew in a furrow of torn earth. I didn't care about the plane. I cared about the canister of film behind the seat, the reconnaissance photos of the Orel salient. If I didn't get them back, the deaths of the rest of my this morning were for nothing. I crawled up the wing, ignoring the heat searing my palms, and ripped the cowling latches open. The Daimler-Benz engine, usually a masterpiece of engineering, was a mess of oil and steam. I wiped my goggles, squinting against the glare. There, the vibration had sheared the oil coolant return line. A clean break. The lifeblood of the engine had pumped out into the slipstream until the pressure dropped. I stared at it, my mind shifting gears. The pilot was gone. The blacksmith remained. I needed a bypass, a sleeve, something to bridge the gap. A bullet kicked up dirt 3 meters from my boot. I dropped behind the engine block. The shot had come from the tree line, maybe 400 meters out. I saw the muzzle flash, the dull gray shapes of Soviet infantry moving through the brush. They knew I was down. They were coming to collect their prize. I scanned the wasteland. 50 yards away lay the skeleton of a GAZ truck, twisted and gutted by a direct hit. I didn't think. I ran. I stayed low, sprinting through the craters, my breath tearing at my throat. Another shot whined past my ear, close enough to hear the displacement of air. I dove behind the truck's chassis, gasping. Debris was scattered everywhere. I rummaged through the scorched metal, my hands moving with a frantic, tactile intelligence. Too thick, too brittle. My fingers closed around a length of hydraulic tubing from the truck's brake system. It was steel, roughly the same diameter as my coolant line. I yanked it free, cutting my palm on a jagged edge. Now I needed to shape it. I crawled to a heavy, dislodged armor plate lying in the dirt, part of the truck's plating. It was hot from the sun and the nearby fires. A field anvil. I pulled a heavy wrench from my flight suit pocket, a talisman I always carried. I laid the Soviet steel against the armor plate. I struck the metal. The sound rang out, absurdly bright in the dull roar of the battlefield. I wasn't fixing a machine. I was beating the iron into submission. I needed to flare the ends, create a friction fit that would hold against the pressure. They were getting the range. A round pinged off the truck axle above my head, showering me with rust. I didn't flinch. I couldn't. My world had narrowed to the steel tube and the rhythm of the strike. I was back in Augsburg, the smell of cold dust in my nose, my father watching over my shoulder. I struck it again, sweat stinging my eyes, mixing with the grease on my face. The tube began to flare. It was ugly work, crude. A master craftsman would have wept, but I wasn't making art. I was making survival. I grabbed a handful of copper wire from the truck's loom. That would be my clamp. Come on, I hissed, grabbing my makeshift patch. I broke cover. The air around the plane was buzzing now. The infantry was moving faster, emboldened by my silence. I vaulted onto the wing of the Bf-109, sliding into the exposed engine bay. I was completely exposed. I jammed the Soviet steel over the German fracture. It was tight, too tight. I hammered it down with the wrench, the sound of metal on metal echoing like a dinner bell for the snipers. I wrapped the wire around the joint, twisting it with pliers until the copper bit into the steel, my knuckles white, my breath coming in ragged sobs. Hold, I whispered to the machine. For God's sake, hold. A round punched a hole in the tail section, then another through the canopy glass. I dropped the wrench. It was done. I scrambled backward into the cockpit, practically falling into the seat. My hands were shaking so badly, I fumbled the primer pump. I locked the canopy. The sound of the rifle fire muffled slightly, replaced by the heavy silence of the cockpit. I primed the engine. Once, twice, I flipped the magneto switches. M1, M2. I stared at the starter handle. The Russians were maybe 200 meters away now. I could see their individual shapes, the dark brown of their uniforms. I pulled the handle. The inertial starter whined, a slow, rising groan. Turn, I begged. Turn over. I engaged the clutch. The propeller jerked. The engine coughed, spat a cloud of blue smoke, and died, silent. I saw a soldier drop to one knee, raising his rifle. I pumped the throttle again, flooding the cylinders. Wake up, I pulled the starter. The whine again. The clutch. The engine caught with a roar that shook the airframe. It wasn't the smooth purr of a Daimler-Benz. It was a ragged, throat-tearing growl. But it was power. I slammed the throttle forward. The 109 lurched, fighting the friction of the earth. I kicked the rudder, swinging the nose away from the tree line, and let the beast run. Chapter 4. The cooling of the iron. The takeoff was not a flight. It was an escape from gravity's jail cell. I pulled the stick back before I had true flying speed, relying on the slat's lift and sheer desperation. The wheels left the dirt, bounced once, and then we were clawing for the sky. I stayed low, clipping the tops of sunflowers, banking hard to put the smoke of the burning tank between me and the rifles. I didn't breathe until the altimeter read 500 meters. The cockpit reeked of sweat, fear, and the heavy, metallic scent of hot oil. I looked at the pressure gauge. The needle was trembling just above the red line. My Soviet patch was holding, but the engine was hemorrhaging life. I throttled back to the bare minimum required to stay airborne. The roar subsided to a chugging, uneven rhythm. It sounded like a bucket of bolts being shaken. Every vibration traveled up the stick and into my arm. A Morse code of distress from the machine to its master. I was alone in the gray sky. The Battle of Kursk raged miles behind me, a smudge of darkness on the horizon, but here, in the limbo between the front and the airfield, it was quiet. I checked the map case. 40 kilometers to the airfield at Orel. In a healthy bird, 10 minutes. Today it felt like a flight to the moon. I looked down at my hands. They were black with grease and dried blood, trembling slightly on the stick. These hands had shod horses. They had forged gates for the mayor's garden. They had fixed plows for farmers. No, they wired broken parts of death machines together to deliver pictures of where to drop the next bombs. I looked at the film canister. It sat innocuous in the mounting, just celluloid and chemicals. But inside were the ghosts of the men who died getting us here. Karl Friedrich. The engine missed a beat. My heart stopped with it. The needle dropped, then flickered back up. Easy, I whispered, patting the instrument panel. Easy, old girl. Just a little further. I flew gently, banking with agonizing slowness, treating the airframe like it was made of glass. I could feel the heat rising from the floorboards. The engine was cooking itself. The oil was leaking, I knew it. My patch wasn't a cure. It was a tourniquet. 10 kilometers. I saw the airfield in the distance, a scar of brown dirt against the green. A dusty beacon. I had never seen anything so beautiful. I reached for the radio button, then stopped. No radio silence. Not now. I simply waggled my wings, a weary wave to the ground cruise. I lined up for the approach. I was coming in high. I didn't trust the engine to give me power if I undershot. Gear down. I murmured. I pulled the lever. The hydraulics whined. Sluggish. 1 green light. 2 logged. The runway rushed up to meet me. I pulled the throttle back to idle. The sound was final. A hammer blow to the front of the plane. The propeller seized instantly, freezing as a static bar across my vision. The silence that rushed into the cockpit was heavy, suffocating. The oil pressure needle collapsed to 0 and stayed there. I was a glider now, a 5-ton brick of aluminum and steel. Falling, I was 50 feet off the deck. The runway threshold was rushing closer, but not fast enough. The nose dropped. I hauled back on the stick, trading my last ounces of airspeed for lift. The stall warning horn blared, a high, mocking shriek. Stretch it, I gritted out. Stretch it. The wheels brushed the grass short of the runway. I braced for the impact. The 109 slammed onto the dirt, bounced heavily, and slewed onto the runway. I kicked the rudder to keep her straight, but without the prop wash, the tail was dead. The plane ground looped, spinning violently to the left, tires screaming, dust billowing in a choking cloud. We slid sideways, the strut collapsing with a groan, the wingtip digging a trench in the earth. And then we stopped. The dust settled. The ticking of the cooling metal began. The sound of a forge cooling down at the end of the day. I sat there for a long time, unable to move. My hands were still gripped around the stick, knuckles white. I forced my fingers to open, one by one. They were stiff, claw-like. The canopy slid back. A mechanic was there, his face pale. Herr Lieutenant, are you hit? I looked at him, unseeing. I looked at the film canister. The pictures, I croaked, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. Take the pictures to the intelligence officer. He scrambled to obey. I climbed out of the cockpit, my legs giving way as my boots hit the ground. I sat in the dirt, leaning against the broken wing of my plane. I looked at the nose. Oil was dripping steadily onto the dry grass. I saw my repair through a gap in the cowling. The piece of Soviet brake line, scorched and ugly, wired in place with copper. It had held just long enough. I pulled off my leather gloves. My hands were burned, cut, and stained with oil that would never fully wash out. I used to believe that I was the one who shaped the metal. That was the pride of the blacksmith. You take the raw iron, you heat it, you strike it, and you make it what you want it to be. But as I sat there in the shadow of the broken war machine, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized I was wrong. The war was the fire. We were the iron. It heated us until we were white hot, malleable and screaming. It struck us again and again with hammers made of fear and duty. It folded us over, beating out the impurities, beating out the softness, beating out the humanity, until all that was left was something hard, sharp, and brittle. And like any piece of work-hardened metal, if you strike it enough times without letting it rest, without letting it anneal, it doesn't bend anymore. It snapped. I looked at the oil seeping into the cracks of my skin. I was 25 years old. I felt ancient. I was a tool that had been used too many times. I closed my eyes and listened to the ticking of the engine. It was the only language I understood anymore.